Do you have any other advice for vampire role players?
If you decide to come up with your own bloodline instead of using one of the pre-existing bloodlines that are in the game, please stop and think very carefully about the abilities that you give that bloodline, because again, you don't want to make your character overpowered. That just makes a character absolutely not fun to play with, like probably faster than anything else you could do except maybe barring metagaming.
Yeah.
And try to be mindful when you roleplay of a vampire's weaknesses. When I roleplay Seasoned Shadow, and I never state it out loud, but I'm sure that there are probably several people who have interacted with him enough to know that he has several unusual tics about him, as it were, and they're largely because he is a vampire. He will not go near fire. He doesn't use any implements that are silver. And other various things of that nature. Again, kind of the paranoia setting in, but at the same time, you have certain things that you have to consider. Your character is a vampire, and those things are there constantly. So if you just incorporate them subtly, you'll find that it really increases the immersion that you have when you're playing the character.
Absolutely.
So, like, as an example of trying to incorporate a vampire's weaknesses into your roleplay, C's has always been of the mindset that when with your magicka, you need to be very careful about when you use it. He originally learned his spell casting in the Argonian village of Soulrest, and he was being trained as a healer. And so one of the things he was taught is you have to be careful about your magicka, because you never know when somebody's going to get drug in from the marsh having been completely mauled up, and you need all of your magicka to basically be the difference between life and death for them. So, it's something that you have to have all the time. C's hobbles around all over the place, and I've had people ask him in characterly, why don't you just levitate? I know that you can cast that spell, why don't you? And so that would be his explanation why. But he will use telekinesis and levitation spells while he's cooking. And I'm surprised that people have never really mentioned that. But the reason he uses those spells while he's cooking is not as any endeavor to show off his magical prowess. That's not really how he likes doing things. It's because he doesn't want to get near the fire. So, he'll chop something up and then put it on a plate, and then have the plate go and hover over the fire while it's cooking, and then he'll float it back over to the table because he doesn't want to get anywhere near that fire. Or if he puts some tea on, he'll have somebody else go and heat the water, just like, Kadava, go over there and put the kettle by the fire.
And everyone just thinks it's because he's old. And
yeah, that's probably C's best resource, is actually the fact that he is old. He can get away with a lot of crap just because everybody just assumes he's really old.
And you put a lot of effort into emoting about how he's hobbling and stuff.
He plays it up. It's entirely on his part. He recognizes that it's an asset for him.
That's got to be fun though for you.
Oh, it's a blast. This is Hans' favorite character I've ever role played.
Nice, that's awesome.
So we had some questions, right?
We do. We have lots of questions.
Well, I'll see what I can do.
And these are questions mostly that people sent to you.
Yes.
And the first one is, this is a great one. Can vampires make babies? Do they have a soul? Can they bleed? I guess we'll take that one at a time.
Yeah. So we'll start with the vampire babies one, and this is one of those widely discussed vampire topics in the lore community. The obvious answer would be if you consult the journal of Lord Leviticus from the Arena questline in Oblivion. You find out that the arena champion at the time is this gray-skinned orc who seems to have this unnatural strength about him, and he doesn't know who his parents are, and he gets you, the player, to try to figure out what his parents are. And this diary entry suggests that he is the child of a vampire lord and his orc servant.
Oh, wow.
So the at first answer would be that this is that this character that's mentioned is a half vampire, a living half vampire. And please do not play one of these.
Why is
Something
that?
like that would be so incredibly unheard of. Like I couldn't imagine something like that being common enough for somebody to role play one. And it really
It's
just,
like role playing a Dragonborn.
well, and it just kind of it kind of screams of something that, like, I want to play Immortal, but I want it to be something that's stronger than Immortal. So I'd like all of the cool stuff about being a vampire with none of the downsides.
Yeah, definitely.
So just please don't play one.
Not to mention, Elder Scrolls lore is, always subjective. You don't even.
That was the next thing that I wanted to say, actually, was I mentioned that this is a very frequently discussed topic. There is a perfectly valid school of thought that because the evidence that you have is so circumstantial, you actually can't conclude that that this is actually the case. I mean, at the end of the journal, this vampire lord goes stark raving mad from not being able to feed because he gets locked in a room in his room by his orc handmaiden, and then she flees the building. So, I mean, it's circumstantial evidence. And I personally operate under the school of thought that vampires are capable of reproduction. It seems like one of those things that Molag Bal would kind of throw in there because, the whole domination thing. And it's just another aspect of the vampire's tortured existence. I mean, there is a perfectly valid counter argument that the evidence is circumstantial. So do take that with a grain of salt. Do vampires have a soul? Yes, they have a soul. In fact, a soul is very much so necessary for the disease. I don't know if I can easily come up with a direct lore source that just says vampires have a soul. But the way necromancy functions in the Elder Scrolls setting is necromancy is essentially the magic of manipulating souls. So the way a undead entity works is you actually wrest a soul from wherever it was located through necromancy and force it back into a dead body, and this animates the dead body. So in the case of a vampire, their soul was never allowed to leave their body when it died in the first place, and that's what makes them undead. For a little bit more information on kind of the intricacies of the soul relationship and vampires, you could see the quest line in Elder Scrolls Online setting, actually, because the main character does not have a soul at that point in time. He has a vestige, and the vampire disease behaves differently for him because he does not have a soul. This is actually mentioned by one of the characters in the quest line, so that could be a certain degree of confirmation for you, if you will. A frequent point of discussion in the lore community is, first off, it's very difficult to cure vampirism, to the extent that it is really, by all practical terms, next to impossible for a roleplay character. If your character is turned into a vampire, curing your vampirism is not a casual thing that you do on a Tuesday. This is something that requires making multiple daedric deals, or dealing with covens of hag ravens, or fighting vampire lords. It's just not something an ordinary NPC is capable of doing. It's something that would be the ilk of one of the divine or semi-divine main characters of the game. The interesting thing about it, though, is in Elder Scrolls Online, you can cure your vampirism by just going to a priest of Archay and paying, I think it's 500 gold. Why can just a lowly priest of Archay cure this instance of vampirism when Archay himself was incapable of curing Ma Bal's vampirism? She was the first vampire. And the answer for that is actually very clearly explained in the quest line itself, and I have the dialogue right over here.
Ah, that look. So familiar. Your mouth is dry. Your blood boils in your veins, while your skin turns as cold as ice. Your body does not accept the blessing for what it is. It resists. Oh, interesting.
So, yes, the interesting thing about it is, because the vestige is a vestige, he actually does not get killed by the vampirism virus. In fact, the ability to have a soul gem revive your body from death is actually an in-character ability of the vestige. They're capable of doing that. They're next to impossible to kill because of their very nature. So this vampirism disease is incapable of killing the vestige. So the vestige has to willingly take on the vampirism virus, or he can have it removed by a priest of Archay, who is presumably capable of doing a blessing to cure diseases.
Nice.
So that is why the vampire, and only the vestige, can have a priest of Archay cure him of the vampirism condition.
Which, for the record, nobody roleplays a vestige, because that
Please don't.
Yeah, that's, again, that's like Dragonborn status.
And no one's going to let you roleplay the Nerevarine. No one's going to let you roleplay the Dragonborn. Please don't roleplay the vestige. Personally, I'm of the school of thought that it is perfectly okay with somebody roleplaying a Soul Shriven. In fact, I would love to see more Soul Shriven, but there's a difference between the vestige and a more run-of-the-mill Soul Shriven.
Absolutely.
And I will save that conversation as another episode for you.
That said, why don't we get into our next question? Can they bleed?
Yes, actually, vampires can bleed. Blood is essential to the vampiric condition. In fact, we see in the Elder Scrolls quest line, when the vestige is, it chooses to accept the vampiric condition, and they go through the trials that Ma Bal gives them personally, that when they choose to accept it, they are forcibly exsanguinated by a pair of vampires in LeMay's black pool, and their blood is replaced with her own.
They do have black blood then, which is another thing some people talk about.
The LeMay's bloodline seems to have black blood. I don't think we could say that of the entirety of vampires as a whole, but yes, for LeMay's bloodline, they do seem to have black blood.
Nice.
Since that is the noxophilic sanguivoria condition, I roleplay Seas as having black blood too, which is why he needs a illusion spell to make it red.
Speaking of blood, can vampires drink bottled blood as opposed to feeding?
A fantastic question. In the game Skyrim, actually, the Volokar are willing to sell you bottles of blood. What should be noted is that in this particular instance, the Volokar are the only vampires that we have seen that are capable of doing so. This seems to be a special bottling treatment that is unique to them. So if you're a Volokar vampire, you may have access to bottled blood, but vampires as a whole don't seem to have access to it.
Interesting. Could they drink daedra's blood instead of a living creature?
I am not exactly certain that daedra even have blood in the first place. They may. I do not know. I can't say that for certain. It's very clearly stated in Vampires of Ilike Bay that vampires have to feed off of the living. They have to feed off of living things. Daedra are not mortals, so therefore, technically speaking, they're not living. So I don't have any direct confirmation that says that they can't feed off of daedra, but I would be willing to err on the side of they can't feed off of daedra.
Yeah, that makes most sense. I'd like to see any discussion about that in the comments, too. That would be interesting to see if anyone comes up with something that you couldn't find, although I don't know if that's possible.
You are too kind.
Somebody asked, don't vampires' souls get sent to Molag Bal's realm after 3 days? Do you know the basis for this question?
The basis for this question comes largely from the fact that vampires, when they first receive the disease, whatever disease it is that they catch, the disease has an incubation period of 72 hours, 3 days. And after that, they die. And so I suppose the question is, when a vampire dies from the disease, is their soul sent to Coldharbour, which is Molag Bal's realm? And the answer to that would be no. Their soul remains in their body. It's necessary for the undead condition.
And that ties into another question, which someone was asking, do they die?
Vampires are a very special case of death because some things that they have some of the typical traits of death. There are a lot of vital organs that don't work. They don't breathe. From what we can tell, they're cold. They're pale. But that being said, we have had very recent confirmation, actually, in the form of the second enchantment hireling. She is one of House Ravenwatch's vampires, and she is your enchantment hireling, and she actually mentions in one of her letters that vampires actually do have a pulse, so they do have a heartbeat. And as we said earlier with the can vampires have babies, apparently something is still working there too. So there are things that still function like they were living, but overall, yes, vampires are very much so dead. They are dead things. I try to incorporate this into my roleplay a little bit with Season Shadow, in that he does not eat, or he tries to avoid it whenever it's possible, because his stomach doesn't actually digest anything. It's just a kind of an organ that's there. So if he eats something, it either sits in there and rots, or he has to throw it back up later, because he's not actually digesting anything. And every once in a while, he'll be in a situation where somebody just like absolutely forces him to eat something because they're concerned that he's never eating, and he's like, ugh, fine.
That's so cool. I love how I really like your style of role-playing a vampire, because, you're focused on things like that. To me, the fact that C's has to force himself to eat for appearances sometimes, and then go, have this terrible experience of forcing himself to throw it up later, that is a million times more fascinating and more interesting than I'm just super fast and strong and evil and dark and spooky,
Well, the hard thing about it is, and this is why vampire roleplay is really not something for everybody, a lot of this happens when people are not around. A lot of this roleplay is strictly for my own benefit, and no other people will get to experience that. And for some people that, like me, that's very entertaining. For other people, I was talking to someone the other day, and I'll avoid using names just for the sake of being polite, but we were discussing roleplay and how there are various different levels of roleplay. You have roleplay that is in large group interaction, then roleplay that is small group interaction, then roleplay that is by yourself. And these different roleplays appeal to people differently. Some people strictly roleplay in the large group level. That's all the roleplay they do. Some people only roleplay in roleplay that is interacting with other people, be it small group or large group. And that's perfectly okay. What's important is that you're having fun. You just need to take into consideration when you're role-playing a vampire, because of the secretive and reclusive nature of vampirism, you're creating a character that is going to have a lot of his role-play, especially the vampire-related role-play, be in private.
And that would be different if they were in, say, a coven or
yes, that would be different if they were in a coven.
Which I would love to see more, really cool lore-following vampire coven guilds. That would be really neat, actually, because there's tons of vampire role-players out there that basically don't get to roleplay with large groups of people. It would be nice for vampire roleplayers to have a place they could go, kind of, to be open about their vampirism.
As somebody who roleplays a vampire, I wholeheartedly agree.
But C's probably wouldn't go. I mean, he obviously wouldn't join a coven, but
he hates vampires.
Yeah. So let's move on to the next question. This is a question I really, really like. How closely tied are vampires with Molag Bal?
Yeah, that is a very good question. And the answer to that would be integrally and inescapably. And I have seen numerous people attempt to argue against that point, and I have to say that I respectfully disagree. First off, Molag Bal was the one who created vampirism as a condition. And Molag Bal created vampirism, and this can be found in numerous lore sources, so I'm not even going to bother citing. But Molag Bal created the vampirism condition to be a mockery of RK, because RK had grown proud of his circle, and heaven forbid an daedra be proud of their work. So Molag Bal created vampirism specifically in the form of raping LeMay Bal to death. Yep. He and not only did he rape her, he mutilated her. She was a pile by the time that he was done. You actually see a little bit of this in both the Elder Scrolls Online Blood Scion quest and in, I believe it's called Le Mesamorte Molag Bal. I think I said that right. But she actually, like, when the other she was the high priestess of RK. And when the other priests of RK found her, she was like, her bones had been broken and all this stuff, and they just put her on a funeral pyre and were going to light her up. Then her bones started knitting themselves back together, and that was when they recognized what exactly was happening, and it was at that point that they all died. So also let it be on record, Molag Bal as a vampire also survived being burned on a funeral pyre.
Oh, yeah.
If you know anything about vampires, that should be pretty darn impressive.
And she's obviously a special case.
Yeah. Oh yeah. She is the special case. So first off, Molag Bal is the originator of vampires. Molag Bal is also the daedric prince of domination and the collector of souls. Vampirism is supposed to be a system of domination. Vampires feed off of mortals, but vampires at the same time also have to feed off of mortals. They do not really have much of a choice in the matter. Domination works both ways in this relationship. And when a vampire dies, and this is going to be one of those more interesting to cite claims, but when a vampire dies, their soul, as far as we can tell, goes to Coldharbour. And so a lot of people are now going to say, well, there's really nothing that says that. I will counter that. First, let us go to the private papers of Galar Rithari, Buoyant Armiger. In this journal, we learn that Galar Rithari was a buoyant armiger who surrendered himself to a gentleman and his allies in a fight that he had lost, expecting an honorable treatment at his surrender. Instead, he found himself the feast for a blood-drinking monster, in his own words. And from there, he became a vampire. He says, I was shamed by my corruption and despairing of my own welfare, I privately acquiesced in my gradual integration into the affairs of Clan Aenday. I hope I pronounced that right. I made no human my prey, only beasts. So he did not feed off of any humans. He only fed off of animals in the time that he was a vampire. And he kept himself apart from his other clankin. Nonetheless, I abandoned all hope and lived like a beast. So he knew that when he had become a vampire, regardless of the fact that he only fed off of animals, never mortals, he still acknowledged the fact that his soul was doomed at the time. Then you go on later, he says that he was drawn by intimations of his former life and visited his former post at Bal-Ur, hoping to atone in some way for his crimes by preying upon the monsters within or perishing under their attacks. And it was there that he made a petition to Molag Bal himself at an altar deep in the caverns. He was surprised that when either Molag Bal or some aspect or agent of him offered a chance for him to cure his vampirism in return for a favor. He said that with no hope for my soul or spirit unless I might be cured, I undertook this quest. So he recognized that there was no hope for his soul unless he got his vampirism cured. So when you combine that also with the quest line in Skyrim for the companions, you look at the quest line there, it heavily involves lycanthropy, the werewolf condition. And there it is very clearly stated that if you are a werewolf, your soul goes to Hircine when you die, regardless of what your religion is. So I don't see why it would be any different for that and not vampires.
Definitely.
So the truth of the matter is vampires are inescapably attached to Molag Bal. A lot of people say, well, what about the Order, the Imperial vampires? They worship Clavicus Vile. That is true. They worship Clavicus Vile. They also worship Molag Bal. They have two Daedric princes as their lords. Clavicus Vile is the one that gave them supposedly, they claim a deal with Clavicus Vile is what gives them the ability to perfectly integrate themselves into human society. Molag Bal is still one of their patrons because he started the whole vampire thing. You can't get away from it.
Interesting. That adds another very tragic aspect to the vampire roleplay.
Yes, vampirism is a curse, and anyone who does not actively worship Molag Bal should regard it as such.
Mm-hmm. That's sad.
It is.
It makes me sad. Let's see. So we have a couple more questions here. Vampire strength and senses greater than a mortal or not?
Yes, they are. First off, vampires, as far as we have seen, all seem to universally have the ability to see in the dark. It has been manifested in several different ways across the games, be it the ability to see living things, to just flat-out night vision. Obviously, in ESO, there's no such mechanic for that, but it is mentioned in passing a couple of times. Vampires do have a certain degree of extraordinary sense. They also have enhanced strength and speed. Another universal trait to vampires is they seem to have a unnatural resistance to harm. That's a trait that seems to be consistent across vampirism of all types. Whatever it is about them, be it that they have vital organs that aren't really all that vital anymore, to maybe just some sort of magical bond that's just holding their body together. It takes a lot to hurt a vampire. In fact, in earlier games, you could not hurt a vampire with weapons that were below a certain tier of material, and silver was the first material tier that became capable of hurting a vampire.
That's right.
The first interesting thing to note about silver weapons is that all silver weapons that have been ever featured in any of the games are all bladed. None of them are blunt silver weapons. And it seems to be that silver bypasses this unnatural resistance to harm that vampires have. In the case of these earlier games, it was a material that allowed you to actually harm vampires in the first place. In later games, it was vampires had a passive damage reduction, and silver weapons give you extra damage against undead, so it offsets that damage reduction. So the end result being, if you're going up against a vampire, it's a very good idea to have a silver weapon because now you're actually fighting them on even footing.
Nice.
So that's another one of those traits that vampires have that kind of make them slightly above more mortal foes. They don't have to breathe, obviously, because they are dead. They're immune to poison and diseases entirely because they are dead.
Regarding the silver, does it burn them like we see in other fantasy settings?
Well, it's difficult to say to a certain degree. You never actually see any instances of silver burning a vampire. I'm inclined to say no. Elder Scrolls vampires kind of behave a little bit differently from other ones. But you see in Skyrim, in the Volikar's castle, you can find things like silver jewelry, things like that. So it seems to be that for the most part they recognize that they have a weakness to it, but at the same time it clearly, I think just from the fact alone that all of the weapons that are silvered are all bladed weapons.
Yeah, that's a pretty good indication.
It needs to be something that actually cuts into the skin to harm them. Just the blunt impact alone isn't going to do it.
Speaking of special traits, how about sunlight? How does it work for vampires?
Sunlight is bad news for vampires. First off, sunlight affects the different strains of vampirism differently. The Noxophilic Sanguivoria vampires, one of their bloodline abilities is they are not harmed by sunlight. That's kind of their big deal. They are like the chosen few vampires that can actually go out in the sun without just outright dying. For a lot of other vampires, they have to be well fed in order to go out in the sunlight on a regular basis. And what that means is you have to feed on something every single night in order to remain well fed. That is going to be something that is, if you stop and think about it realistically, very difficult to do. if you try feeding on a mortal being every single night, you are probably going to get caught.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just how it works. Somebody's going to notice bodies start dropping eventually.
What does it do to them specifically?
It cooks them. In fact, we jump to Chapter 2 in Vampires of the Ilac Bay, and this is just after our vampire character has been turned. And it says, I left the snow-white corpse in the alley and ran to the only place I felt perversely safe, the mausoleum. For the first couple of days of my undeath, I starved myself while I considered my fate. I relearned what I was capable of doing and found out that I was stronger, faster, tougher, and more agile than before. There we go. There's our citation for stronger vampires.
Yep.
I'm serious. This book is a must-read for vampire. I had powers that as a knight I had only seen powerful mages wield. Later I discovered additional abilities such as total immunity to disease, helpful when descending on plague-stricken cities like a jackal. I also found my weakness. I could no longer stand in the light of the sun. Exposure to it for longer than a few seconds burned me terribly. It also pained me to enter temples and other places of worship.
Interesting. Little side weakness there, too.
Yeah.
I don't see people roleplay that either. I see vampires in temples all the time.
You will notice C's is not overly fond of going around hist trees.
Yep. He keeps his distance.
Yep. Definitely won't touch hist sap, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, think about that for a second. A devout Argonian being entirely cut off from his religion. That's not a very happy thing for him.
That's pretty sad, yeah. And that brings up the question, actually, is C's still connected to the Hist, or has Molag Bal just kind of kept him away from it?
I like to imagine that there is still kind of a tenuous connection there, but it is like barely even anything worth talking about. I mean, he can't commune with the Hist at all. He can't go near his sap. He can't go near places of worship, not without being in pain. I mean, every once in a while he'll do something that is like he recognizes it's going to be painful and he just has to tough his way through it.
Right.
You know, all for the sake of keeping up appearances, right? But for the most part, I mean, he can't go anywhere near any kind of religion whatsoever. Worshipping the Hist is a religion.
Right.
So, you know.
That's sad. C's is so tragic. People are going to watch this and be like, I had no idea. This is probably my favorite question, which is why we're saving it for last. Rarity and knowledge. Are vampires considered to be common knowledge among citizens of Tamriel? Or would they be more of a superstition known by many but believed by few?
The answer to that question is actually, it depends on where you are.
That makes sense.
Obviously, somebody who's well educated in the subject is going to have plenty of knowledge on the topic. If we go to Immortal Blood.
Such a good book.
Actually, I could talk about that book for a little. In fact, I think I will talk about this book because that book is complicated. But we see in this a fighter of the undead, a valiant vampire hunter consulting a priest for knowledge on vampires. And this one particular priest, who we actually later find out is a vampire herself. Spoilers, I'm sorry. She has obviously an immense knowledge of vampires, being that she is one. This self-admitted hunter of vampires, however, has very limited knowledge of vampires. He's having to consult somebody else for this knowledge. That being said, there's also going to be certain racial variations. Morrowind, for example, highly suppresses any knowledge of vampires. That's just one of those 1984 style censorship of information that goes on in Morrowind, those darn tribunal. They want people to believe that vampires as a whole have been entirely eradicated from Morrowind.
Really? I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Knowledge of vampires is highly suppressed in Morrowind. So at least that happens around the time of Morrowind itself. It's difficult to say what the condition would be like 1,000 years earlier, like we're in an Elder Scrolls Online. But yeah, there's definitely some suppression of information. It's also said in several places that knowledge of cures for vampirism is also suppressed rather actively because there is a widely held belief that if there were a readily available cure for vampirism, people would seek out vampirism because it would be easy to fix if they didn't like it.
That's interesting.
So, as a whole, actually, there's a lot of misinformation on vampires. You see a couple of casual references in a couple of books even to using stakes to stop a vampire, when there is no mention that a wooden stake to the heart actually will do anything to a vampire. But let's actually talk about Immortal Blood for a little bit, because I think
that kind of goes into the misinformation.
Yeah, the book Immortal Blood has to be taken with a huge grain of salt.
A mountain of salt.
A veritable pillar of salt. The only bloodlines in Immortal Blood that you actually see that are seen in game are the Volokar and the Order, the Imperial bloodline of vampires. So all of these other bloodlines in here, we have no idea if the information in here is actually correct about them or not, which typically would be an okay assumption that this is an accurate description of their vampiric abilities. It's a lore book. That's where we get all of our information. The problem is that we run into is in her description, first off, of the previous individual she had been giving information to Cinia Grey, and then second off, her description of Volokar vampires in the book. It says in the book, "Vampirism," he said, and then he paused at my quizzical look. "I was told that you were someone I should seek out for help in understanding this. Who told you that?" I asked with a smile. "Cinia Grey." I immediately remembered her, a brave, beautiful knight who had needed my assistance separating fact from fiction on the subject of vampire. It had been 2 years, and I had never heard whether my advice had proven effective. "You've spoken to her. How is her ladyship?" I asked. "Dead," Morvath replied coldly, and then, responding to my shock, he added, perhaps to soften the blow, "She said your advice was invaluable, at least for one vampire. She was tracking another, and it killed her." So we can see from this, especially combined with the knowledge that the author, in fact, is a vampire, and not just any vampire, but a vampire of the Order who thrives off of misinformation, that she was providing information to a vampire hunter, and that this information did eventually lead to this vampire hunter's death. So we have to automatically assume right off of the get-go that the information in this book is probably meant to be misinformation, not actual information. This is supported later on by her description of the Volokar vampires, where in this book she mentions that the Volokar vampires breathe ice that will chill the blood, and then the hunter returns saying that the Volokar vampires could raise their hands through frozen lakes without breaking the ice. These are two abilities that we never once see the Volokar vampires use in the entire Dawnguard expansion of Skyrim. It seems like if this were the primary vampiric ability of the Volokar vampires, they would have used it at least once.
Yeah.
You don't see that at all. So the book Immortal Blood, it's a good source of inspiration, and if you're a role player and you're really wanting to role play one of these other bloodlines, yeah, you can probably get away with doing it, but just do be aware this lore book is most likely supposed to be misinformation, not actually accurate information. It was written by a vampire.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I feel like we covered a pretty wide range of topics for vampire role players. They could definitely use this as sort of a guide to figure out exactly how they're going to play their character, so that's exciting.
And, of course, if anyone has any questions about role-playing a vampire, people to talk to, stuff like that, please feel free to contact me in-game at Ma1function. The first L, the only L in the name is a 1. I'm always happy to help out where I can, but please consider my advice earlier that was given and think about why you want to role play a vampire and give it some serious thought before you actually go through with it, because it is actually a fairly difficult thing to role play. That being said, as a particular little statement to some of the non-vampire role players in Elder Scrolls Online, please be a little bit generous. It's a two-way street. It's a
Yep.
hard thing to role play, and people are trying. Um, I mean, metagaming doesn't help anybody. It's actually kind of a rude thing to do. Try to be cooperative where you can. I mean, if the person's just obviously being a troll or power gaming or what have you, then do what you will. But if it seems like they're giving it a good college try to be a little bit generous.
Absolutely.
The other thing that I wanted to mention is I noticed there are an awful lot of guilds that will not accept vampires on their roster whatsoever. And I can understand the mentality for that decision because, vampires definitely don't fit the theme for every guild, especially guilds that are heavily involved in places of worship. But again, I think it should be said a well-played vampire actually does add a considerable darker element to a role play, a very interesting element of conflict in a way, not only of self-conflict, but of, light versus the dark sort of deal. And I think it's not necessarily a very good idea to just dismiss it entirely outright because vampire roleplay has such a bad reputation. I'm sure there are other vampire role players out there that you have no idea about because they're doing a very good job of role playing a vampire.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, really, if you stop and think about it, if somebody's doing a good job of role playing a vampire, you should have no idea they're doing it at all.
Yep.
Unless you're about to die. Just again, it's a two-way street. That's the whole point of collaborative role play is it's a process of working together.
Yep.
Try to be mindful of that when you're interacting with other people.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if I hadn't let you in my guild because you were a vampire, that would have been a very poor decision.
That being said, at the whole two-way street thing again, I also tailored my character to fit your guild because I wanted to be in the Banescale Fellowship.
Right.
So,
right.
It goes both ways. You can't shoehorn a character that doesn't belong into a guild. At the same moment, you shouldn't dismiss someone outright simply on the grounds that they're a vampire.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, that was great. I think that we covered pretty much every question someone could have about a vampire. But if they do have more questions, they should definitely get a hold of you because you take the time.
Yeah, and I will be providing citations for all of the claims that I made in this interview that you can have access to afterwards.
Yep, that you can check them out in the description. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Mal. It's always good talking to you, of course. And finally got you on the show, which I feel like has been long in coming. So
I am always happy to help with Scrollplay where I can.
Awesome. Yeah, in the future, maybe we should do a magic roleplay.
I'm always down for talking about Elder Scrolls metaphysics.
Well, thanks again, and I will see you soon.
All right. Ta-ta for now.